Welcome to this journey from Yerushalayim, exploring systems thinking, innovation, Judaism, and how it all worked out. It's basically a review of my career. This talk shares my thinking process. It's related to systems engineering because, according to my friend and mentor, Derek Hitchens in the UK, systems engineering is a way of life. And as far as I'm concerned, systems engineering is the application of systems thinking to problem solving. So this journey shares the thinking process that led to out-of-the-box innovation in systems engineering, project management, and postgraduate education, and some disturbing thoughts about Inkosi Jews and Judaism, and working out how you can become a systems thinker as well. But before I go into that, I want to share the situation maturity awareness level with you. You're in a situation, I'm in a situation, and most people are there at level one. They don't even realize that something is wrong or undesirable. The next level up is identifying that something is wrong and then accepting it, grumbling and complaining, working out what is wrong and doing something about it, either trying to change it or walk away. For example, you have a cup of coffee in your hand. Have you ever wondered why the cup is that size? Here's the cup. Most people don't. They just go ahead and accept it. When you start asking the question why, and you understand it, that might lead to innovation, because you may say, well, maybe something else would be better. But that's not the point of the talk I want to mention. But that question why is how you climb the ladder, or how you climb up from the different maturity levels. So what I'm going to talk about is back in 1981, once upon a time this story starts. And then I'll go through the places in my career, go back to the University of Maryland, University of South Australia, Cranfield University, National University of Singapore, now I'm in Adelaide. And then I'll talk about how you too can become a systems thinker. Back in the 1980s, Luz in Yerushalayim was building the world's first commercial solar electrical power generating system. It was the first of its kind. It was a small and medium enterprise. It was a startup company. The research was done in Yerushalayim, and the installation was done in the Mojave Desert in California. And so you can see that the design is done in one place and the installation is done in another place. And this is what it looked like during the installation. So you can see the size of the mirrors, they're pretty large. The mirrors are about shoulder height on a person, and they're very long. And the way they worked was they were laid out north-south, and as the sun moved across the sky, the mirrors moved tracking the sun. The sun heated the oil in the pipe at the center of the mirror, and that oil was pumped through the system into heated water into a generator, and the generator produced electricity. Complex system, but it was the most cost-effective way of generating solar energy at the time. So the situation was there were around 600 mirrors, unknown electromagnetic environment. There were mechanical electronic interfaces. There was no land space. We had a little plot of land across the street where we could build up just the center of the mirror and one or two mirror elements. There were language difficulties. The mechanical department spoke Russian, the physics department spoke French, the electrical department spoke English, and there were people, you get into a meeting and there were people who didn't have a common, who didn't understand one of the other languages. I'm sure dealing with Olim, you've been in that situation before. So the meetings every now and again had to stop for translations. And I remember sitting in meetings and wondering why they were having problem with teeth. Teeth? Because they talked about teeth all the time. And I thought, okay, these are the mechanical people and they must have some problem with the gears. It was only months later that I realized they were not talking about teeth, they were talking about changes. The word for tooth and the word for change in Ivrit sound very much the same. And in my learning curve on Ivrit, I didn't realize what they were talking about. The company had minimal resources, it was a startup, there was no requirements document, and there was no concept of operation document. The elevation was, mirror was controlled elevation only. There were wide tolerances on the north-south alignment of the field because we didn't have GPS and you couldn't tell exactly where north was. But the mirror pointing requirement was plus or minus 0.2 degrees. The sun sensors were mounted on the mirrors. The mirrors could vibrate with the wind, but there was no specification. There was no specification on the sunset other than it, on the sun sensor, other than it gave out a voltage plus or minus depending on whether the sun was ahead or behind it. And apparently there was no upfront systems engineering. So as a systems engineer, I asked myself, where are the requirements? What is the concept of operations? What is the accuracy of the sun sensor calculation? Who controls the motor movement? Where is the intelligence in the system? What is the effect of mirror vibration? What happens when the scattered clouds block the sun for periods of time? What is the nature of the electromagnetic environment? What kind of data does the local controller need to receive and generate? What voltage is power to be distributed to the motors? What about maintenance and troubleshooting? Nobody apparently had thought about that by the time I came into the job. Let's think about them. They were thinking about using a mini computer-based central station. I think they were dreaming about it because nobody knew anything about mini computers. I had a little experience. They were thinking about using an Ethernet 10 megabits per second network, which was brand new at the time, so it was high risk. They were using dumb microprocessors for local controllers. They were thinking about using pulse counting position sensors on the mirrors. Every time the motor rotated, it would generate a pulse. But this was relative. The moment you lost power, you lost your position. And they had three-phase electrical power motor controllers, which were blowing silicon-controlled rectifiers. Not very good. The prototypes were unsuitable for a large array. For example, they were using logic boards that didn't have a fan-out, capable of more than 10 components, and they were going to be 600 mirrors. And my boss, who was now the vice president of engineering, was responsible for the situation. And it was my first position as a manager. So what happened? "18 months later, when I left Lewis, the central station and the local controller network was installed and worked first time. I saved them $300,000 per central station computer because I worked out a way to use a Z80 8-bit microcomputer instead of the mini computer. It was delivered on schedule. There were minimal problems, no software problems, because the software was pretty basic. There was one hardware problem, a cable that was bought in the US, and the cables were manufactured in the US. The ones they bought there were not as flexible as the ones we used in Israel. So apparently after a while, they sort of stress on the connector. The connector came away from the board. That was easily found and fixed because the connector was off the board. So you pushed it back in and you fixed it in place. And I'm told there was a latent defect in the sun sensor. So how did this happen? It took me 15 years to figure it out because I had done it without thinking about what I was doing. All right, how did it work? Well, first of all, the lessons learned. Keep it simple, system engineer. View the problem from several perspectives and focus on the people. The expertise must be intuitive and not in the manual or the standard. Keep the number of requirements small. Don't specify upfront details that can best be left to designers and other stakeholders to determine interactively further down the life cycle. We've got, for example, we've got data on the screen of the control system. We don't need to specify all the details up front. We just need to know what needs to be shown. We don't have to worry about the positions on the screen or everything. Leave that for later. You can start work without knowing those details. And things that don't care at the moment can hurt you in the future, like the sun sensor. Now, some of the information as I go through this talk, I will be skipping the details. Some of that information is in hidden slides. Watch the slide number and you will see the numbers don't go up one at a time. If you get a copy of the handout, the information is there. Other information is in my publications over the years. So, was it a system or a system of systems? The local controller was a system. It was a mixture of commercial, off-the-shelf, and custom parts. The arrays of local controllers was a system. The local controllers and the central station was a system. The whole field was a system. They were different systems. So one of the lessons noted after the fact is system boundaries are drawn from a purpose to abstract out the clutter. When I'm dealing with a local controller, it's my system. I don't care about anything else. When I'm looking at the array, that's my system. Central station is my system. The whole field is my system, depending on what level I am and what my problem is. Very important lesson. So then I went back to the US and I went to the University of Maryland and I was teaching project management, but I couldn't teach the students the answer to the question, what do you mean you can't tell me how much of my project has been complete? Earned value analysis only measures the money spent. How many requirements have been completed? Well, even if you could know that, it doesn't help you because they come in all categories and sizes, and the amount of work you do on one requirement can be 10 times the amount of work you do on another requirement. But you can group them into ranges. So I asked the standard copycat question, who has faced the problem before and what did they do about it? And I found something called feature-driven development by somebody named Felsing. And I thought, hey, that was good. But again, he was going through every single feature, which gave you a tremendously long list, and also didn't show much because, again, the features, different features had different degrees of complexity. So I came up with something called a categorized requirement in process chart. I took all the requirements and sorted them out into categories. Categories of cost, risk, complexity, and so on. Divided each category into 10 ranges and allocated the requirements into the range. I could then take a look at the number of requirements in a system. And for example, here we have 279 requirements in the different categories at the start of the project. Now, each category, each requirement can be in 5 states: identified, in process, completed, in test, and accepted. Each state has 3 elements in the row: P, E, A. P is planned, E is expected, and A is actual. So when a project starts, we go through the statement of work and we come out with a number of expected requirements, and we show it like this. The project has started, but we don't know if they're actual, because once the project starts, we then go back to the statement of work, we negotiate it with the customer, and we see if there have been any changes since. So by the time we get to SRR, we have identified requirements, 279, but there have been some changes, so we're up to 292. And so I can color the differences so it becomes very easy to see. So we're at SRR, we've identified this number of requirements, 292, and if everybody agrees and there's consensus, we're going to move on past the SRR. So we plan to put all those requirements into work. So they're copied into the planned column. When we get to SRR, it was good. No new requirements were identified. That's good. The number of actual requirements that were in process at PDR are exactly the same as the ones expected, so there's nothing wrong there. Everything is good, and we're moving on. We're not planning to complete anything because we're still in PDR. We've got to go through CDR and build them. By the time, on the other hand, if there's a project with requirements creep at PDR, you can see it very easily in a similar chart, because it shows that 20 requirements, new requirements, were identified in range 1. They were accepted and they were worked on and they're ready to go. And similarly, you can see here. You can also see that in range 5, 2 requirements and they're through. In range 7, 4 additional requirements and they're through. But in range 9, we identified 10 additional requirements, but we haven't done any work on all 10, so we're short. This tells you what is going on, but it doesn't tell you the reason. It's a very useful tool. And what's more, you should see the impact on the EVA cost and the Gantt schedule charts of these additional requirements. I introduced this tool in my classes at the University of Maryland, and one of my students picked up on it and started using it in her class, and she came back at the end of the semester, she said her management loved the tool. So that was good, positive use. But now, the next tool dealt with planning. Planning is a little difficult to do. How do you make sure you cover everything? So I came up with a product activity milestone chart, PAM, because in general, in a large class, there might be one person with the name Pamela, so it links. Each milestone takes place when work has been completed or a product has been completed. Each product has activity to complete it and uses resources and starts at a previous milestone. Each activity has 3 streams of work: management, development, and test. I'm not going into any details, I'm just giving you a heads up on the tool. Read all about it. But this tool can also be used to facilitate prevention. Because, for example, let's look at a partial plan charts for making a cup of instant coffee. Milestone 4, the product is a stirred cup of coffee ready to drink. Which means between milestone 4 and milestone 3, you have to stir the mixture, which means you need a spoon, the mixture, and a person to do the stirring. When you get to milestone 3, you have a set of mixed ingredients, so you need to add the ingredients, which is you need ingredients and a person. So you need the ingredients, which is before milestone 2. On the other hand, you also need the hot water, which become part of the mixed ingredients. So you need a hot water and a person. Then you need hot water, and so you need something that will generate the hot water. Water, kettle, electricity, person, and so on. What's missing? You end with a stirred cup. The cup doesn't show up anywhere in the process steps, so that's missing. But I teach planning as working back from the final product. So I would plan making a cup of coffee in exactly the same way as I went through this chart. But then I would document the plan starting from the beginning. And by doing this, I can show prevention, or at least I can not only show it, I can include it. For example, there's a partial line here. I can identify a failure in task A8-1 and arrange to prevent it there. And then in my work package for task A8-1, I can put a link to task A3-1 to show that the risk identified in A8-1 is being mitigated in 3-1. So I sort of building, risk planning is built into planning in the systems approach this way. I went to the University of South Australia in 1999. I went through a very unpleasant divorce, and I wanted to get away as far as I could from Maryland, and a job opened up in South Australia, and my brother was buried in Melbourne, so I went down to South Australia. When I came down to South Australia, I ran into a situation in the Adelaide Hebrew congregation. There was something wrong with the rabbi's performance. So I started thinking about the Torah and about Judaism. I'd never thought about it before. I mean, I'd lived it, I'd learned it, I'd seen it. I grew up in the United Synagogue in Egerton Road, and my father was the shamus, and I knew my way around the service and around everything. But then I thought about, what is a commandment? It's an instruction to do or not do something. So at the system level, for example, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, it's a what commandment? And Hillel's golden rule is the how. He explained it more. But then you can look in the Torah and you can find what commandments and how commandments. So example, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha in Vayikra, the way you do it is in the Aseret Dibrot in Shemot. Lo tirtzah, lo tinach, lo tachamah. They're all ways of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. What else happened in Adelaide and how the synagogue hired a security guard to keep me out from the services for a while, and some of the comic aspects of it is another story. But if you look at the derived requirements from the Torah, I think they can be taken to ridiculous extremes. And a few years ago, I wrote a satire And the concept here is that if Christmas had been a Jewish holiday, Art Scroll might have produced a book something like this. I showed it to some of the Nkosi fellows, and they just cracked up laughing. I tried to show it to some Dati, semi-Haredi Jews. They wouldn't touch it. But you can get it from Amazon. It's really cheap. And if you send me an email, I'll send you a PDF. I didn't do it to make money. The concept covered preparing for Christmas, the tree, decorating the tree, the lights, and so on. The rituals and the service and Christmas and Hanukkah. And let me give you some examples. Dealing with the size of the tree. The required height of the tree is as follows. According to Bet Shammai, an indoor tree must be tall enough so that the space between the top of the tree and the ceiling is less than 1 amma. An outdoor tree must be at least 20 ammas tall. On the other hand, Beit Hillel said size doesn't matter, it's the overall effect that is important. And there are some footnotes. Where local fire codes prohibit the use of such large trees, a smaller tree may be used in accordance with the principle that Jewish religious laws do not overrule the secular law of the country. And footnote 10 is the ruling is according to Beit Hillel, namely size doesn't matter. Or this one, the holiday party. The mitzvah of holding a holiday party requires a great deal of ritual drinking. One must drink and continue drinking up to the point he cannot tell the difference between his wife and his secretary. So the footnotes go, in this case, up to means up to but not including the point where he cannot tell the difference. Once one has reached this point, he is excused from further drinking. All those who are machmir in the performance of this mitzvah often continue drinking past this point. And I must point out that this whole concept is based on an email that was circulating on the internet around that time with about a quarter or less of the laws and customs that are in this booklet. Back to UniSA, I started trying to teach systems thinking. When I taught systems thinking, I could tell you how important it was. I could tell you the history of it, but then I had to say in about 20 years' time, when you'll do it, you'll know it. And that's not a very desirable situation. I wanted to be able to teach it. I couldn't. I look on the internet and there are drawings on the internet, and this is from PowerPoint clip art. How useful is this in teaching systems thinking? Notice there's no output. Or this one. It's a very nice diagram, it's colorful, but it's totally useless for anything practical. Or this one. It is so ambiguous, it's totally meaningless. I really don't like these circular drawings because they don't show any relationship. Or this one. No wonder it's extremely difficult to teach systems thinking. And in terms of the course content of systems engineering courses, there were no requirements, which I find to be totally strange because systems engineers deal with requirements. And yet universities have no requirements for the content of a course in systems engineering. So as a result, they all teach different things. I'll come back to that in a little bit. And I found myself, I was often telling the students, and you won't find that in the textbook. And I mentioned what I was saying when I was teaching systems thinking. And all the courses were lecture-based. And the books of notes were getting thicker and thicker and thicker because they contained more and more PowerPoints. And the pedagogy recommended active learning and what became known as flipped classrooms. So this wasn't really good. And as a result, we had death by PowerPoint. One thing that did come out of it was the Hitchens-Massey framework. I was working with Angus Massey and we were looking into what should we teach in a course in systems engineering and try to arrange the materials. So we said, okay, let's take Derek Hitchens' 5 layers of complexity and the life cycle states, and then we can organize the knowledge by what does a systems engineer who is working with requirements, for example, in 2B, need to know? And then we could teach that. But then when we looked into what systems engineers did in area 2B, the role of the systems engineer was basically anything his boss or her boss told her to do. So we concluded that developing a body of knowledge for systems engineering based on what systems engineers actually did was impossible because we'd have to put everything in it. So we let that go for a while. Now this situation was undesirable. So, and my situation at UniSA was also getting a bit tough, and with the Adelaide Hebrew congregation was also getting a little tough. So it was time to move from Adelaide. I looked around for a grant to develop the course and to develop ways of teaching systems thinking, and I found it in the UK. So we had an agreement with Cranfield University, and so I suggested to Phil John in Cranfield that we work together and put in a grant. And if we won the grant, I would come up to Cranfield and do the work. And I was also being tasked to develop some grants as part of my job description in academia in South Australia. To my surprise, we actually won the grant. And so I moved from Adelaide to Cranfield for a year and developed the first course, and then perfected the systems thinking aspects of it over the next few years in Singapore. So, coming to Cranfield University. Dealing with a course, it's traditional in Judaism to ask 4 questions on Pesach. I know it's coming up to Rosh Hashanah, and I will deal with that later, but traditional 4 questions. In terms of the product, the course, who are the stakeholders and what should be taught? Process, how should the course be taught? And then the design requirements, so what would it take to create a course that met the requirements? So let's look at each question. Skipping the first one because of lack of time. What should be taught? Whatever it takes to produce these type of systems engineers, types 1, 2, 3, and 4. Who can be told how to implement a solution, who can be told what needs to be done, and define the solution. And then those who can define the problem, and those who can conceptualize and create the solution. Based on the 5 types of systems engineers. Traditional courses focus on type 1 and 2. They deal with the process, but the cognitive skills of type 3 and type 4 were not generally taught. How should the course be taught? Well, no more death by PowerPoint, fundamental or prime directive. We need to use problem-based active learning. It should emphasize conditional, not decorative, and procedural knowledge. And flipped classrooms don't work in practice, because in a flipped classroom, the students are supposed to read the material first before they come to class, and then in class they discuss it. Well, I found most of the time the students didn't the material ahead of time, and so I spent time lecturing the material. Not a desirable situation. So, cut a long story short, I created the first ever block mode immersion course in systems engineering. Very little lecturing, mostly exercises. The first class ran with 8 students who were beginning their engineering doctorate program, and they went into shock at the workload. But they coped with it. They were expected to do it, so they did it. And I found that throughout my career. If you expect something from the students, they will do it. And so each time I expect more. The learning appeared to be better than earlier lecture-centric classes. For example, day 2 in Cranfield, the students demonstrated the skills that it took them 5 days to demonstrate at UniSA. So this was a great improvement. The overall student evaluations were positive, and 7 out of the 8 students recommended that other classes be converted to the format in spite of the workload. That was really good. I did it again in NUS in January and May 2008. And this was before I joined NUS. So I taught it as an external course. January had 50 students, May had 15. Maybe they heard about the class, I don't know. But there was a similar response as in Cranfield. The initial workload overload, similar improvements, similar daily student comments, and overall evaluations. But I was trimming the workload and putting in a little bit more lecturing as the class evolved. Now, thinking about systems thinking, let's think about thinking. You look in psychology, and here's an example of the human information system as compared to a computer. You have sensors for seeing, hearing, smelling, and tasting. That goes into sensor memory. It moves into working memory and in long-term memory. And thinking process moves data about and processes it. And these days we have extended memory, which can be computer readable or papers, books and notebooks and things. That's all thinking. All right. So the thing that we developed in Cranfield was the standard systems thinking perspectives, which became the holistic thinking perspectives. And I've taught it to some of you here who were in the audience in the past, but you've probably not retained it because I taught it in the lecture-centric mode, and that's not a very good way of teaching. And there were 9 perspectives. Now, if you think about the blind men, the story of the blind men examining the elephant, each one examines the elephant from a different perspective. And what you have to do is to be all the blind men and examine the elephant from all the perspectives. And then which perspective is needed? Well, it depends on the problem. If you've got external perspectives, internal perspectives, and progressive and remaining perspectives, and I'll show you them in a little bit. If you're dealing with how the object relates to something, then you need more or less what we call systems thinking, and that's the external perspectives. And if you look at systems thinking, came out of the operations research world where they're looking at how the system relates to other systems, and they're not concerned about what's inside the system. On the other hand, if you've got a problem inside your system, like your car didn't start this morning, systems thinking doesn't help you in terms of how the car relates to the streets and the traffic and the other things. You need to know the internal views of how it functions. And the progressive and remaining ones, we'll talk about that in a moment. So which perspective you need depends on what problem you're facing. And so sometimes you need systems thinking, sometimes you need analysis, and sometimes you need to go beyond systems thinking. Systems thinking and analysis will give you an understanding of the situation, but it's the progressive and remaining perspectives that show you the solutions, as I will explain. And then you need some critical thinking. Here's an example. I'm living in Singapore. It's my first example in the tropics. We go on a department trip across to Malaysia. We go to an orchard, and I see these trees with plastic bags on the tree. And I look at them and I think, wow, a plastic bag tree. I didn't know plastic bags grew on trees. Did you? A lot of you are smiling. Why are you smiling? Well, you know that plastic bags don't grow on trees. How do you know that? You have the domain knowledge. You know where plastic bags come from. You might have the orchard domain knowledge to know that plastic bags are put on the fruit to protect them from pests. But in any event, you have domain knowledge that tells you plastic bags don't grow on trees. But supposing you didn't have that domain knowledge, you might apply for a research grant to improve the yield of plastic bags, or another research grant to change the color of plastic bags. You're laughing. But in the real world, this happens because when we're doing scientific research, we don't have the domain knowledge. We're just learning about it. And so we apply for grants to examine different things, and eventually we find out what works and what don't work. But the lesson that comes out of this is when you're thinking about something in problem solving, the conclusions, decisions, and inferences are only as good as your domain knowledge. It is important to recognize when we don't have the domain knowledge and to bring in somebody who does, a consultant, an expert from another department or whatever. Important lesson. Now, since I've been in Adelaide, I have been writing up the work that I was doing. And while I was in Singapore, I got a contract from CRC Press to write a book on it. And as I started writing the book, I realized that it wasn't going to be one book, it was going to be at least 4 books. And so I started writing, so I wrote the books. Now, the first book was Systems Thinking Toolbox. And when I looked, after I had written 3 books and published them and just submitted the manuscript on the last book, I thought, let's see how useful these systems thinking perspectives really were. So I went through the book and I counted the number of times each phrase was used: big picture, operational, functional, structural, quantitative, generic, continuum, and temporal, and so on. And I noticed that the generic and the continuum perspectives showed up a lot more than the other ones. The generic perspective is when you perceive the similarities between your system and other systems, and the continuum perspective is when you perceive the differences. And so, as I said earlier, the traditional systems thinking perspectives, big picture, operational, the analysis, the functional and the structural perspectives help you understand the situation. The solutions come from the generic, continuum, and temporal perspective, and the quantitative perspective just contains all the numbers. So when I looked at my book on project management, again, there's a lot more operational functional because we're dealing with management. But when dealing with problems, generic and continuum are also much stronger. In the one on systems engineering, operational comes up really high because systems engineering deals with creating the operational system and keeping it running. And so generic and continuum come down a little, and the functional and the others go up. And in my book on risk management, in the draft manuscript, you can see that the temporal perspective is way up because we're projecting risks over time. And the functional and the structural perspectives are way up because we are looking at what can go wrong in the functional, in the way the system operates, and the failures in the structure. And so to me, it pretty much balances out quite nicely. And the other tool I had for using the holistic thinking perspectives was to come up with this active brainstorming matrix. And so when you're into a situation and you're studying it, from each perspective, you can ask a set of questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. In the big picture, who's using the system? What is the system doing? Where is it doing? When is it doing? Why is it doing it? How is it doing it? Operationally, who's using it? Functional, what are the functions in the street? Structural, what physical parts do they need, and so on. And in my books, there are lots of typical example questions to ask. Now, I mentioned earlier about planning, when I talked about the PAM chart, about how we work backwards. So in planning, we start with a system. It needs to be integrated. It needs to be tested. It needs to be built. It needs to be designed. It needs to be specified. So we plan the work based on, we have a system. What does it take to integrate it? Once we've figured out how to integrate it, we know what we needed to integrate it. We can then figure out what we need to do to test all the parts that are going to be integrated. And once we've got all the parts ready to be tested, we've got to figure out what it takes to build them, and then what it takes to design them and specify them. By doing it this way, we prevent missing things that need to be done, because you're starting from the end where you've got something, and so you're moving backwards. If you started from the front, you might forget to specify something and then not realizing it, and then move forward. So it cuts out a lot of the errors. And once you've worked this out using PAM charts and cost charts and whatever, Gantt charts, you then document it as a forward-looking plan, the traditional forward-looking plan. But this is a process flow view of a project. If you look at it in the waterfall view, it looks like this. If you look at it in the V view, it looks like this. So what this is showing you is the waterfall and the V models, as they call them, are identical. They're different views of a process. And by the way, how many of you know that the waterfall view is really a Gantt chart? Or an n squared chart? Didn't see it that way. Moving on to project reporting. There was a time when I was at UniSA when I was managing 11 projects, and I had to put together, we had David Cropley just took over as center director, and he wanted a report from each of the project managers on what their projects were doing at the next staff meeting. So I started putting together a report like this. And so the context is academia. I had 11 projects. I put together 126 slides, data, continuity, some progress, humor, and I recorded the presentation because I knew I wasn't going to be there. I was going to be at an INCOSE workshop, and it was a 90-minute recording. And of course, he didn't play it because who's going to talk for 90? I mean, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, that happens a lot in many projects. There must be a better way. So I thought about it for a while, and I said, we have a traffic light chart. Traditional traffic light charts show a snapshot in time, red, green, and yellow. the project's in trouble, we give it a red light. If the project's everything is fine, we give it a green light. And if there are issues, we give it a yellow light. But we could use the temporal perspective like we did in the quick chart, and I came up with something like this. And again, this is written up. You could look at the state of the project and give it a color, but instead of at the next milestone just having another single snapshot, you could start comparing the information. So, for example, for each of the projects here, I show you the state as it was last time, and last time the project manager has to predict where they expect the project to be at the following milestone. So then the next column is what the project manager expected it to be. So for example, you can look at project 2. Last time it was yellow and the project manager expected it to be green, but the third column is the actual where it is now, and it's still yellow. And the project manager is projecting for the next time that it's going to be in the red, in trouble. And you can see different things. Like project 5, very happy customer, is ahead of schedule, and project 9 is in trouble, and project 8 has budget problem and is in the red all the time. Now you can look at this and you can say, project 1, everything is fine, we don't need to look at it at this meeting. We need to look at project 2 because something is wrong there. We need to look at project 4 because nothing has improved. We need to look at project 9 because it's in trouble. We need to look at project 10 because they're expecting problems next time. And then if there's any time left in the staff meeting, we can look at some of the other ones. Simple chart like this allows you, links very much nicely to management by exception. Very simple tool, and it's very, very useful. Now you can show how these charts come together in a systems approach to project management, that the information you generate goes into work packages using PAMs to plan the data. Your work breakdown structure is not an input tool, as in the traditional project management approach. It's instead a hierarchical view of the data. Product breakdown structure is a hierarchical view of the products. And doing this way, the WBS and the PBS are in step because they come off the same data. A PERT chart is a dependency view of the work packages. A risk plan can be written based on the risk attributes in the work packages. A Gantt chart is a schedule view. EVA shows the cost progress as you go through the work. But what this system's approach shows you, which you don't have in the traditional project management view, is quick charts will show you technical progress, and the enhanced traffic light charts will give you management progress, which you don't have in traditional project management. Crampy was over, and I was asked to go to National University for a year, and I had worked with the NUS people before in teaching those courses, and I had realized that they were a very nice, proactive bunch of people. And so when I was asked to go to Singapore for a year, I said yes, and then I realized I hadn't discussed the terms and conditions. But it was fine. And income tax was really low in Singapore, so I did quite well. The thing I wanted to do was improve the education. And you can see from this picture that I have taught in Israel before, but I was teaching block mode classes, and so I'm not sure how much of that information was retained by the students. Now, in teaching, there's this undesirable situation. When you're in lecture mode, the students don't retain it for too long. In the flipped classroom, students are supposed to read the session material before the session begins that don't. So instead of the lecture just summarizing and highlighting the material and adding additional material pertinent to the session, the lecturer has to go over the material the students were supposed to read. And then you have group exercise, you have presentations from exercises, and then you have a short discussion facilitated by the instructor. But since the students don't read the material ahead of time, there's a lot less time available for the interactive learning. So here's something I redrew from Dale's cone and also the learning pyramid, in that the retention percentage 2 weeks after a class, based on the teaching style or learning style, is like this. And you can see that lecture is the worst. Teaching others for immediate use and practice by doing is the best. And traditional classes had an awful lot of lecturing, very little practice by doing, and no teaching others for immediate use, which is the reverse of this. So how can it be reversed? Just a continuum perspective on teaching and learning. The boy says, I taught Spot, my dog, how to whistle. His friend says, I can't hear him whistling. And the student says, I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. And that's what that retention rate is all about. So what's the desirable situation? Remember I talked back earlier about we need type 3s and type 4s. Well, we need to, I found this set of requirements, Wickline et al. In 2009, providing the 5 top aspects of the engineering design process that best equip secondary students to understand, manage, and solve technological problems. And these include systems thinking and problem solving, but you don't find them listed on any curriculum. The grading needs to be based on cognitive skills and knowledge, the higher levels of Bloom taxonomy, not just repeating back the information that they were taught. We need to go beyond systems thinking, and we need to give them some of the domain knowledge. So the solution situation was to add something I call knowledge readings. So you have the traditional classroom session, you have lectures, exercises, and the individual assignment, but I brought in knowledge readings as well. What I did was I made the students, not only did they have to read the material ahead of time, but they had to present based on what they read. And if you link this into Bloom's taxonomy, you can see that traditional classes taught remembering, very little applying, a little bit in the exercises, understanding a little bit in the exercises, but the higher levels, analyzing, evaluating, and creating, were not in traditional classes. The moment you bring in the knowledge readings, it's all there. And the students really like them as well. And so you bring in top 5 aspects of Wickline: multiple solutions to a problem, oral communications, graphical, pictorial communications, ability to handle open-ended, ill-defined problems, and systems thinking. And by using lecture, exercises, and knowledge readings, you cover it all, which is really good. The students also, when I give the knowledge readings, one of the pluses is the different students are presenting on the same thing. And so when the students are asked to pick out what the main points of a reading are, when the different groups or individuals present, we find that they've picked out different main points. And this brings in a lesson that says, if you're giving people documents to read, you want them to extract the information you want them to extract, not something else. So you need ways of highlighting what's important and what isn't, so they all extract the same information. Let's take a look at complexity. We see examples like this, and nobody is willing to stand up and say shtuyot. Nobody's willing to stand up and say this is rubbish. I don't understand it. Well, I am. This is a load of rubbish. There are multiple layers in the hierarchy in the same reading, which violates systems thinking. And if you think about Miller's rule, it's just a total amount of rubbish. And we have all this artificial complexity around us, and nobody's willing to say this isn't right. So let's think about complexity. Here's a disturbing thought. You look at the definitions of complexity, they all use the word large to define a complex system. Although there are a few definitions that do give a number, the numbers are all different, and there's not a justification of the number. So the question is, what's a justification or a justifiable value of large in the definition of complexity? Okay. Let's use the generic. Definitions of complex and non-complex of systems are generally the same. The common element is there are objects and relationships between the objects. The differences are in the level of difficulty of understanding, and the definitions of and the objective complexity. Definitions of complex systems usually contain the word large. The quantitative numbers, some of them may contain numbers, but they're all different. It doesn't make sense. So let's think about it. 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 Complexity is in the eye of the beholder. Jackson and Keyes, 1984. But from the functional perspective, complexity is actually sensed by the eye of the beholder. The beholder thinks about the complexity, so complexity is in the mind of the beholder. There is a limitation on the number of manageable elements in the mind of the beholder. That's Miller's rule, 7 plus or minus 2. So conclusion is the value of large is more than 7 plus or minus 2, applying Miller's rule. So if we want to simplify complex systems, we need to aggregate them or group them together into no more than 7 plus or minus 2 elements at any layer in the system. And then we can manage them. Okay? Now let's take a look and see if anybody out there is actually doing this successfully. Where is that number being used? And you look at the idea of span of control in management and civilian and military organization structures. The Romans worked in tens. All right, 7 plus or minus 2, that's a rough number. And sometimes I wonder if 7 plus or minus 2 in the Romans tens, where that number came from. Did you count the number of fingers? 8 fingers and 2 thumbs. How do they do it? they use the principle of hierarchies. So I think I have defined the value of large in a justifiable, the number large that separates a complex from a non-complex system as 7 plus or minus 2 in a justifiable manner. Of course, it might be a plastic bag tree. I might be wrong. We'll see. Which brings me to Inkosi. Remember, I said that there were no requirements for teaching courses. As part of my work at TDSI in Singapore, in the National University of Singapore, I was pretty much running the technical content of the classes, the systems engineering classes. And so I was looking around every year at other classes in systems engineering to see what they taught in case they were teaching something we weren't. And this is based on a process I developed years ago and is documented in my writings. But it was in 2013 that I had the time to do a proper study. So I was in, let's see, how does this go? I was in Philadelphia at the Inkosi conference, and I looked around at the universities that were advertising in the educational area, and I noticed that, as usual, they were all teaching different things. So I collected brochures and interested Eileen Arnold in doing a study of what they were teaching and comparing them. And I did the study, we did the study, and we found that they were teaching all sorts of things. And what was taught in one degree was not taught in the other degree. And it was difficult to make sense of what we were seeing until the innovative idea came. Let's see if we can organize this knowledge in the same way as mathematics. So there's pure mathematics and applied mathematics. Maybe we can have pure systems engineering and applied systems engineering. And of course, we'll need domain systems engineering. So then the next question is, well, what goes into pure systems engineering, applied, and so on? So pure systems applied systems engineering is traditional systems engineering, requirements, architects, VMB, engineering management, and so on. Pure systems engineering is systems thinking, cognitive skills, problem dealing with, decision making, and so on. And so it's similar to mathematics. When we did that, we found that we could compare the degrees. And we compared them in different ways. And one of the findings was, when you looked at the degrees, you came up with numbers like this. And the numbers showed the percentage of topics in the descriptions of the required courses in degrees on their websites. So if a degree had 10 courses and there were 5 required courses, it got a 50% or a 0.5, and then we looked into the course to see how much of it was actually in the course. And the numbers may not add up to 100% because there are electives. A required course was 10%, an elective course was 0%, because we were only looking at what was taught in the required courses. And you can see that it's all different. And degree number 9 shows that you can take that course, you can get a master's degree in systems engineering without taking a course in systems engineering. Since all the degrees also contained management courses, since the required courses in the degrees contained management courses, we also looked at the amount of management courses in the degrees. Now, when I presented that information at the symposium, I had gone round to each of the exhibitors, the academic exhibitors I had spoken at the week before, and shared the findings with them in case they thought it was sensitive. And they were interested in seeing it, and they said, yeah, it was fine, I could present it. But during the presentation, somebody from Stevens, Mike Pinotti from Stevens, got upset. At the end of the presentation, he kept saying that what I was presenting was not what his degree was all about. And I told him that the information was based on what his website was showing. And he got angrier and angrier, and I was very calm. After the presentation, INCOSE President David Long said that there had been a complaint about what I had said at the presentation, and I told him what had happened. And everything was fine until after the submissions of papers for INCOSE, the next INCOSE presentation, I had an email from Cecilia Haskins telling me they'd received a complaint. I had been informally tried by basically a self-appointed group and found guilty. My punishment was I had been banned from presenting at the next two INCOSE symposia, which for an academic, not being able to publish is very serious. And since my presentations counted for the chapter award for Singapore, she was penalizing the Singapore chapter. And I noticed that the informal trial had violated INCOSE's policies. So I asked her to do something about it, and her reply was, we'll do something after Christmas. Well, by the time you wait till Christmas is over, the deadline for paper, acceptance is all over, and so it would have been bad. So I filed a complaint with INCOSE. Going through the process, I was never informed who complained and what the charges were. Now, surmising that it was the incident in the academic forum, there were witnesses there who stated I had done nothing wrong. Eventually, my punishment was eventually revoked in a letter that I think is libelous for Alan, what's his name, the then president. And as far as I'm concerned, based on that letter, I am still under notice that I can be summarily ejected from an INCOSE symposium if someone complains about my behavior. And so I will not attend another INCOSE symposium, going to the expense of attending if it means I can be kicked out. But that led me to think about INCOSE from the different holistic thinking perspectives. And so I was doing that sort of at the time because I noticed over the years, but this let me, and I had produced a video that I wanted to share with the INCOSE fellows at the meeting. But after this happened, I posted it on YouTube, and you can still do it. Is there value in INCOSE? And I posted a notice about it on the INCOSE Facebook page. It was taken down a few days later, and I get an email from somebody in INCOSE saying, we've removed your posting because it was inappropriate, but we do welcome constructive discussions. And so I thought, oh, well, forget it. When I looked at INCOSE and systems in 2016, I looked at the projects and the process. There weren't anything useful. The certification was narrow. The complexity model was flawed. The website wasn't user-friendly. The dial-in meeting software only worked on PCs and not in Macs. Bookcase and Gracie in education were just useless. And during the time that they were being put together, there were academics who were saying they were not going to use it, but these people had got a grant from the US Department of Defense, and so they were going ahead with it. I asked for the systems engineering analysis that supported Bookcase and Gracie, and nobody knew what I was talking about. And the symposium review process was very subjective. The papers went through a peer review process. There was no qualifications for the peers, and each of the peers was equally voted. So an expert and a beginner had the same vote as to whether a paper should or should not be accepted. And once the peer review process was over, a self-appointed committee went through the papers and kicked out various papers for reasons like this guy's got too many of them, or brought in papers that have been rejected because we want somebody from that country to come. So it was extremely subjective. There's no real value in the publications, and it showed. The leadership, it's a standard volunteer organization distribution. There are very few motivated workers. It's a minority of the membership. Some of them seek status. Others are content to be seen but don't contribute. I found them mostly ignorant. Technical knowledge was lacking. Sometimes the president of INCOSI at the time, won't mention her name, didn't understand the difference between dealing with volunteers and dealing with paid people, and a total understanding of what goes on in other cultures, particularly Chinese and Singaporean cultures. The Americans had no idea. Nobody seemed to be doing the V&V or quality control. The personnel were mediocre at best, at least at the academics. For example, the academics who were involved in the organization, at least one of them hadn't been promoted from lecturer to a professor in 12 years. And there was a lot of focus on startups rather than accomplishments, and most achievements seemed to be meetings took place. They weren't doing anything. Working groups, there were special interest groups that talked and talked. There were working groups that hold meetings and producing useless products like how to write the requirements. They were having fun, mind you, so that's fine. And it was standard volunteer characteristics, doing what the leader wants to do, which is fine. If you want to go to a working group and sit and talk, that's good. I sort of popped into working groups from every 6 months at the workshop and the symposium, and it was like no time had passed. They were talking about the same things. So one time I thought about doing a little video on should you join a working group in INCOSI, and I started off saying, okay, you want to join a working group in INCOSI, that's fine, because that will help your career, because you can get experience in another aspect of systems engineering. And I looked at that and I said, okay, well, the first thing you need to do if you want to join a working group is study up the subject. And then I thought about that. If I tell newcomers to do that, they will end up knowing more than many of the chairs of the working groups, which will lead to conflict. And so I decided not to write that or to produce that video. So where's the value of INCOSI as of 2016? No significant contribution to the discipline of systems engineering, so I called it an international club organized for system engineers. And I asked the question, and I'm still waiting for an answer. I came to Adelaide. And here I had times of recurred, so I went back to thinking about the Jewish topics. And we have brachot before doing something. So we say, Baruch atah, who has commanded us, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, and where? Where are we told to make the bracha, and when were we told to make the bracha? For example, L'hadlik ner shel Shabbat. You read the Aseret HaDibrot in Shemot and Devarim, and it said Shamor o Zachor l'kadshehu, but nowhere does it say light a candle. Well, if lighting the candle is l'kadshehu, then maybe the bracha should be l'kadesh et hashabbat rather than lahadlik. You think so? Am I looking for logic? I don't know. Now another concept I noticed was the Shabbat guy. In the Aseret HaDibrot, it said, "V'yom hashishi Shabbat l'Adonai yeh lo taseh kol malacha ata u'bincha u'bitecha abdecha v'amatecha v'hemtecha v'gercha." Gercha. Ger is the goy, right? But wait a minute. A Shabbat goy is either an abdecha, amatecha, or ger. So the Shabbat guy is an Isur, so using a Shabbat guy is an Isur D'oraita. Do you notice who's missing from that list? Ishtacha. Now, does that mean when your daughter gets married, or your wife is allowed to work on the Shabbat? Or does it mean that the wives are included in Atah? If the wife is included in Atah, then the sexes are equal. And the mitzvot apply to men and women. Disturbing thoughts. What about the Shabbat Jew? A Shabbat guy gets paid to work on Shabbat. Is there a Shabbat Jew who gets paid to work on Shabbat or Chag? Yes, leading the services. The Chazan. The Chazan gets paid to lead the services on Shabbat. Rabbis sometimes do it in the diaspora. Preparing the synagogue and tidying up before and after the services. You can have a paid shamash or beadle. My father was the shamash in Stamford Hill for years and years and years. And that was part of his job. He was being paid to work on Shabbat. And when I was living in Silver Spring, I had a friend who would travel out to various parts of the country and take the services on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in communities that didn't have anybody who could do it, and he got paid for it. And some rabbis may even work 7 days a week. These are Shabbat Jews, and what they're doing is an Isur D'oraita. Disturbing thoughts. Now let's think about 10 Commandments. And we'll use some of these perspectives to think about the 10 Commandments, but I'm only going to focus on one or two of them. What is a commandment? A commandment is an instruction to do something or not to do something. It's a sentence containing an imperative verb like thou shalt honor, thou shalt remember, etc. Or, and, nor are implied constructions, so there are multiple commandments in the sentence. And in systems engineering, we call it a requirement. Take a look at the tablet that's shown here. How many commandments are there? Anachi, lo yeh, lo taseh, zachor, kabed, and so on. But take a look at the first one. Is that a commandment? No. It's a statement, ani. There is no instruction in that statement. So there are not 10 commandments in that tablet. There are only 9. So how many commandments are there really? Let's take a look. We come through, and I'm showing Shemot and Devarim, but I'm only going to commentate on the Shemot ones, except in one instance. So, sentence 3, pasuk number 3. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. That is a commandment. Now, that is worded very carefully. It said al panai. It doesn't say Lo yeh Elohim acherim. And the al panai is repeated in 2 places. That is a tremendous difference, because that means you can have other gods as long as they don't come first. Which means the interpretation that many religions or branches of Christianity and Islam have, where they forget that al panai and they go to war over which god comes first, is unnecessary. The whole situation with the Jews and the Romans and the Jews and the Greeks was unnecessary, because you can have the emperor as a god, or you can have Jupiter or Zeus as a god. That's fine, as long as it's not al panai. And so all the religious strife that we have in history was totally unnecessary, because those 2 words were dropped off. Think about that. That's a requirement. Okay. But there are 5 requirements. Asher b'shamayim mimal, that's one requirement. Asher ba'aretz mitachat, that's another requirement. Asher b'mayim mitachat haaretz, that's another requirement. Kol pesel is a requirement. Kol tmuna is a requirement, and so on. And then in the next one, la ta'aseh lochem v'la ta'odem, 2 requirements. La tishtachaveh lohem, 1 requirement. V'la ta'odem, that's another requirement. So we're getting up to 7 requirements so far, and we're only on pasuk 5 in Shemot. Skip pasuk 6, it's not a requirement. Tisa et shem. Okay, that's a good requirement. That's good. Zachor et yom hashabbat lakadshehu. Okay, that's a requirement. But wait a minute. Zachor in Shemot and Shamor in Devarim are 2 totally different things. The Zachor and Lashmor are 2 totally different functions. So are they 1 commandment, or are they 2 commandments? And that's why I teach in systems engineering that when you are dealing with user needs, to keep the user need, the requirement, use the wording of the need in the requirement, because then you don't get into paraphrasing problems like this. And then we get to verse pasuk 9, Sheshit yamim ta'aseh ta'avod va'asita kol malachtecha. That is a commandment. Does that mean if you work a 5-day week, you are transgressing that commandment? So a 5-day or a 4-day week is an Isur D'Oraita? And then we get to B'Yom Hashvi, Shabbat, and so on, and I've talked about that one and who's missing. And then we get to Kishesh Tamim, that's not, and then we get to Kabed et Avicha ve'et Imecha. That's 2 requirements. Kabed et Avicha is 1 requirement. Kabed et Imecha is a 2nd requirement. So we're up to 14. And then we go to the next 4. And what I've noticed here was when I looked it up in the Hebrew version of the Torah, those 4 requirements are in one pasuk. When I looked it up in the King James Version to get the translation, it's separate sentences. And so we're now up to 18 requirements. And the last one. And again, when you compare Shemot and Devarim, the word Sadehu pops up. So how many commandments are there in this verse? And the order of some of the things is different. For example, if you look in verse 14, as it said, Lo tachamod beit re'echa, v'lo tachamod eshet re'echa. In Dvarim, it's v'lo tachamod eshet re'echa, v'lo tishtachaveh beit re'echa. So you've got tishtachaveh in Dvarim and tachamod twice in Shemot, and they have different meanings. So how many commandments do we have? In the 10 commandments, I found 25. If you want to have some fun, ask your rabbi. Ask your Dati and Haredi friends. And keep pestering them for an answer. You might find some fun. But one of the ways we can explain that is the what's and the how's, where we talk about in systems engineering. For example, in the Aseret Dibrot, Lo Ta'achamod is a what commandment, and then Lo Ta'achamod Beit Re'echa, Eshet Re'echa, and the other Re'echos are examples of how you comply with the original Lo Ta'achamod. So you can make them sub-commandments. And then you've got multiple commandments, as I mentioned before. So, for example, Lo ta'aseh l'chol pesel v'lo t'munah. That's 2 commandments right there. And then you've got Vashamayim ma'al, Ba'aretz, and so on. And again, v'lo ta'achamod beit re'echa, v'lo ta'achamod eshet re'echa, multiple commandments. And more. Lo ta'aseh l'chol pesel t'munah. So whoever wrote down the requirements was not a good systems engineer, because they are not well written. They are mostly not well written requirements. So how many are there? What are they? Why is Sheshit Yamim Ta'aseh Ta'avod totally ignored? Ask your friends that. Why do they ignore that? Does the 5-day working week transgress this requirement? Where do the clergy, that's the rabbi, the cantor, the shamas, how do they justify working on Shabbat? Ask these questions. Make people think about what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying people should change their religion. I'm just trying to raise your situation awareness maturity level. Think about what you're doing. You might think about it and say, okay, that's fine. All right, that's good. I just want you to think. Now let's think about the second day of a Jewish Chag. I was living in Yerushalayim. We had overview visitors, and it was the second evening of the holiday. From an operational perspective, in Israel, you keep 1 day, they kept 2 days. So from a functional perspective, I made Havdalah, they made Kiddush. Doesn't make sense. Ask the question why. We're in the same place. Why should I make Havdalah and they should make Kiddush? So you think about it. In the Torah, in the Chumash, it said the first day of the month is set based on people who've seen the new moon. Well, that means you can't predict the first day of Rosh Hashanah. It's only known after the fact. Well, if everybody's living in one small place, that's fine, because we see the moon and we say, all right, tonight's the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and tomorrow we bring the Karbanot for Rosh Hashanah. At that time, nobody worried about Tfilat Mariv. But by the time of the Nevi'im, the period, the community grew to the whole country, and so people away couldn't be sure when to celebrate the holiday. They had beacons and things. But so they did a bit of risk management. They knew roughly how long the month was and when to expect the whole moon, the new moon, the Rosh Chodesh. So they said, we'll keep 2 days. And so the Chag will be either on the first day or the second day. There's no commandment that says you cannot bring the Rosh Hashanah Korban on a day that isn't Rosh Hashanah. There's no requirement not to. There's only a requirement to. And since the days of the holidays later in the month and the other months were known, there was no need for 2 days. But the 2 days was then later extended to Babylon. You look at it from the quantitative perspective, you can see that Rosh Hashanah shows up on the first day of the month. The others are all later. And even Shavuot. There is no ambiguity on Shavuot because it's the 50th day of the Omer. It's not based on the calendar day. So whatever day you start counting the Omer, Shavuot is 50 days later. There's no need to keep 2 days for Shavuot. And so here's the disturbing thought. Originally, the concept was if you were in Israel, you kept 1 day. If you were in Chutz La'aretz, you kept 2 days. But nowadays, we have Dati and Haredi Israelis who go Chutz La'aretz and only keep 1 day. And we have Dati and Haredi, people who live in the diaspora, they go to Israel and they live 2 days, and they keep 2 days. So the Rabbanot have changed the requirement for 1 or 2 days to be based on their nationality and not on location. This means that they have quietly abolished the rabbinical 2-day diaspora transition, because Israelis who go to Chutz La'aretz don't have to keep 2 days. That means nobody has to keep 2 days. Disturbing thought. What about priority of the commandments? The Torah doesn't prioritize the requirements. Each requirement is important as the next. So we have an evolved hierarchy. We have Doraita, Rabbanan, Minhagim, and so on. But when you come to the question of what makes somebody Haredi, Dati, conservative, progressive, or reform, which set of commandments do they have to keep to be one of the others? Is it based on commandments? What makes somebody Dati, Haredi, conservative, progressive, or reform? Interesting thought. And then we have the separation of church and state. The Torah split the church and state. Moshe became head of state. Aaron became head of church, religion, in Shemot. The Hasmoneans combined them because the Hasmoneans were the leaders and they were also Kohanim. I think they were Kohanim. I don't remember. But anyhow, whether they were or they were not doesn't matter or isn't relevant. In modern Israel, we have religious political parties in the government. So here's my disturbing thought. Since God split church and state, when modern Israeli religious parties take part in the government, they violate the split of church and state. And the state of the government in Israel provides an example of why the commandment exists. Tell that to your Haredi friends. Now there's the 11th commandment. What's the 11th commandment? Most people say it's don't get caught. I think of this one. I look at it as Moshe's addressing the people, and there are two Pesukim in Devarim chapter 4, Pasuk 1 and Pasuk 2. Lo tosifu al hadavar below tikkaru. Don't add and don't subtract. These are the mitzvot. Totally overlooked. There is a difference between adding and interpreting. The Romans deleted the temple commandments by destroying the temple. Without a temple, you couldn't keep those commandments. Rabbinical commandments, they built a fence around the core. They added a fence in case of accidental transgression. But this fence evolved outwards over centuries, and people built fences over fences over fences because they didn't know which was D'Oraita and which was D'Rabbanan. So all these fences take a lot of fun out of life. And then when people rebel, they break the D'Oraita as well as the Rabbanan commandments because they're not taught which is D'Oraita and which is D'Rabbanan. And then the Reform, they subtracted commandments and they took a lot of Judaism out of life. And this leads to assimilation because there is no difference between being Jewish and non-Jewish. I have friends and relatives who are complaining that their children married out. And I thought about their complaint, and I thought to myself, but I did not say it because of Shalom Bayit. I did not say, what did you expect? When did you teach them anything about being Jewish? So a little bit of scientific thinking. There is no divine oral law. The Torah Sheba'al Peh doesn't exist because the commandment said, these are my commandments. The Torah that is written down is the set of commandments. A claim that there is, and I found a claim in Rabbi Levi ben Hama, who said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. There is rabbinic law based on interpretations to fit changing circumstances over time as documented in the Talmud, Rambam, Rashi, Shulchan Aruch, etc., where they were adjusted. And so the warning of the commandment has come true. Additions have led to not keeping the divine, the Torah D'Oraita, as well as evil in organized religion, and subtractions have led to not keeping the D'Oraita, as well as assimilation. Think about that. On the topic of evil, let's talk about kosher according to the rabbinical interpretation. I was doing some research. I've got a book, The London Board of Shechita, by A.M. Hyamson. It discusses the London Board of Shechita from 1804 to 1954. And it talked about how when the Sephardi immigrants came in at the time of Oliver Cromwell, Jews were allowed to return unofficially. Was it unofficially or was it even officially? I don't remember. But the Jews came back at that time. They set up their board of Shchita and the religious boards that they set up. And later on, at the beginning, when the pogroms in Russia took place, the Ashkenazi Jews fleeing the pogroms came in, and they set up their own kashrut board. So, as it's written in that book, you ended up with two kashrut boards doing exactly the same thing. And so, each one is not allowed to eat from the other hechsher. Why? It's all kosher. And then today we have kosher and glatt kosher and whatever. And kosher kosher is a binary thing. Something is either kosher or it isn't. So the whole concept of glatt kosher is nowhere in the Torah. The Torah is, these are the foods you can eat, these are the foods you can't eat. Binary. But what you do find out is you see that the kashrut boards put a tax on meat and other kosher food to support the rabbinates. And so there is a higher tax on glatt kosher food than there is on kosher food. And then we have this thing about basar chutz. Basar chutz means out-of-town meat that might be kosher in the other town is treif in your town. And the reason for that is to protect the local butchers. That's what they say, right? Well, let me tell you a story. I was living in Silver Spring 50 years ago. And it was a community living in apartments, young married couples who with young children, and they socialized on Friday night Shabbat by having meals in other people's houses. One of the couple there were the offspring, and I forget which one, of a butcher in New Jersey. And when they socialized, people would eat at their house and they would say, this meat is really good. Where do you get it from? And the answer was, well, the parents come and visit the grandchildren and they bring the meat with them because, they're a butcher. The situation in Silver Spring at the time was there was no real butcher shop in Silver Spring. We had to drive down to a not so good neighborhood in Washington, D.C. to buy the meat. And the women didn't like going down there with young children, and the butchers wouldn't deliver. And so the question came up and said, this meat is good, it's better than the local meat. Would Moshe deliver, when he came down to visit, would he deliver food to the other people? To know, I'll ask. So the question was asked and the answer came back, sure. So a price list was circulated and people checked off what they wanted and it went back to New Jersey, and a few days later the meat was delivered. And everybody in the community was happy because they were getting meat. And I don't remember if the price was more or less. It must have been about the same, but everybody was happy. The meat was delivered. And you had to buy large quantities. That was the other thing. So it was fine. And then the local butcher noticed that their customers, they were losing customers. So they complained to the Rabbanut about this basar chutz coming in. So one Shabbat, Rabbi Winter stood up in the synagogue and said, Moshe's meat is basar chutz, it is treif, and your dishes need to be broken and your pots and pans need to be rekashered. And there were a few people who did what he said. Most people ignored it. A few weeks later, it became known that Moshe was no longer basar chutz. He was under the supervision of the Vad HaRabbanut of Greater Washington. Moshe needed supervision from Washington, He's under the supervision in New Jersey. In other words, it's financial. It's got nothing to do with kosher, it's financial. More evil, someone who is a Baal Teshuvah is forbidden by their rabbi to honor Kaved et Avicha v'et Imecha, their non-kosher parents who live in a different city, to visit them in case they eat their mother's home-cooked meal and violate the rabbinical commandment to keep kosher. So you have a rabbinical commandment overruling, you have a darabanan overruling a deraita. My scientific perspective says this is not much to do with religion, it's more to do with finance and control. Now, I like this about the Iska Prayer. I looked at 3 different versions of the Iska Prayer, and I don't have the Hebrew, I'm sorry. In the United Synagogue one in 1937, it says, "We beseech thee, Lord of compassion, shelter them forevermore, under cover of thy wings, and let thy souls be bound up in the bond of life, and may they rest in peace upon their couches, and let us say, Amen." Well, by 1975, it was, "May they be at one with the one who is life eternal. May the beauty of their lives shine forevermore, and may my life always bring honor to their memory." There's a little change there, but not much. You get to the art scroll, and it is, "I shall give tzedakah on his behalf. As a reward for this, may his soul be bound in the bond of life," so on, so on, and so on. Can you see the total difference there? There is an evolution in the concept of the afterlife. Art Scroll says, "I shall give tzedakah on his behalf. As a reward for this, may his soul..." What does that mean? First of all, according to the Haredi, while you may not be able to buy your way into heaven, your children can. So don't upset them. They may have the final say on how you spend eternity. From a generic perspective, Art Scroll is similar to the medieval Catholic indulgences. It's not right. So on Rosh Hashanah, we're coming up to Rosh Hashanah now, so thinking about it. Rosh Hashanah yikatev, v'yom tzom kippur yechatemu, aval tshuva u'tzedakah, tshuva tefillah u'tzedakah, ma'avirin et roa hagzera. So the question is, where's that written in the Torah? It's not. The concept evolved. Okay. Nothing wrong with evolution and changes. And sort of tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah are good things. But my question is, what is tzedakah? I thought it was donating money to poor and helpless people. But it seems to be you're supposed to donate money to organized religion, to education, to yeshiva, Jewish day schools, to the synagogues, whether it's Dati, Haredi, I don't know about Haredi, but whether it's Dati, conservative, reform, they want you to organize the money, they want you to donate their money to organized religion. So, from a scientific perspective, it seems to me that organized religion is not about living according to the mitzvah, living according to the commandments and doing mitzvah. It's not about perpetuating the religion into the future. It is all about finance and control. It violates v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, because you get the Haredim fighting with the Dati fighting with the Haredi, and they're fighting with the conservative and the progressive. The whole thing violates. So organized religion is in itself violating Isur Torah. Shouldn't organized religion practice what it preaches? Okay, you too can become a systems thinker. Well, some of us are systems thinkers. Some of us do it all the time, most of the time, some of the time, or none of the time. Okay? When we're not thinking emotionally. Emotions can block this completely. So remember that situation, maturity, awareness level I started off with? Not even realizing that something was wrong. I hope I've identified something was wrong and it hasn't gone right past you. There are many people who, the moment I have said something that is out of they're wearing these blinkers and it's out of their blinkers and they just totally ignore it and move on. I mean, I've been in situations, discussions where I've asked a question, silence reigns, and then it continues like I never said a word. Understanding that, identifying that something wrong is the first step in problem solving. Working out what's wrong is the next step, and doing something about it are the remaining steps. At least trying to change the situation part is the remaining steps. So you too can be a systems thinker, as Lord Kitchener points out. You can become a systems thinker. I developed a simple way to teach systems thinking. I started teaching it in 2008, and I've improved it ever since. Postgraduate students in Australia, Brunei, Germany, Israel, Japan, Singapore, South Africa, Switzerland, Taiwan, and UK found it easy to learn, but I don't think they retained it very well. And but the retention improved when I stopped teaching in block mode and introduced the semester mode balanced classroom. And there's no reason why you can't learn it and retain it as well. What makes it worthwhile? Well, here's one of my students, 6 years after the class, no contact with his student. He sent me an email or a message on LinkedIn, and this was just a few weeks ago. I really enjoyed your teaching at NUS. It was quite a quite memorable course that I often think back on in my professional career. That sort of makes it all worthwhile. Thank you, Matthias. So here's my course. You will learn about holistic thinking and their application, using the balanced classroom pedagogy to maximize your learning, practice, getting guidance to reinforce your learning, and 3 textbooks are supplied as free PDFs. Holistic Thinking, Perceptions of Systems Engineering, and a Framework for Understanding Systems Engineering. So the class starts in October. It uses the balanced classroom approach, not block mode. It's gone beyond the flipped classroom. There are 10 sessions, 1 3-hour session a week. That's worth $4,000 if your company was paying for it in block mode. You get 3 textbooks. That's another $109.85 value. The classes have been discounted because of the COVID, and they're taught using Zoom. And the price is only euros 199. That's less than 20 euros a week, which is the cost of a dinner. How can you afford not to do this? I like doing it, and I want to do it, and I would do it for free. But if I did it for free, lots of people would sign up. Most of them would come to the first class, and a lot more would drop out after the second class because they wouldn't be making a commitment to study it. That euro 199 is your commitment. Go to the URL on my webpage for further details and registration. And remember, class size is limited. because this is highly intensive instructor-participant interaction. So in summary, I covered all of this. Once upon a time, went through what happened at Maryland, UniSA, Cranfield, NUS, and now in Adelaide. And lastly, I showed how you too can become a systems thinker. Any questions and comments? And I'll switch off the recording.